Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Possessions, Personalities, and Plurality panel for EmblemCon 2026. My name is Crescent, or Digital Dreams, and I will be your guide through this journey across series history. Today, we'll be covering depictions of possession and plurality throughout the Fire Emblem franchise, along with the strange middle ground that falls between them. Before we jump in, I want to introduce myself. I'm a longtime EmblemCon panelist, and I've done a bunch of other presentations at the convention. When it comes to informational stuff specifically, I've talked about cut content, glitches, lost media, how games changed in development, beta builds, and as of this year, merchandise. I've recorded all of my past panels on my YouTube page, so if you want to go back, then you can find those online, and I'll link the playlist down in the description of this video. When I'm not presenting at EmblemCon, I write a lot of fanfiction both about Fire Emblem and about other series. I write stuff that isn't fanfiction too, including a fantasy adventure series, and I self-published the first book earlier this year. There's one other thing I do online though, and that is talk about plurality. I have dissociative identity disorder, otherwise known as DID, and I have known about it since January of 2021. I've been writing and posting about my experiences for over 5 years now. I've written multiple works about it, along with in-depth analysis of my interpretations of various fictional characters. I've also been invited to speak at multiple college conferences about this very topic. This is something I'm really passionate about, and that passion hit a turning point in January of 2025. At the time, an anime called Ave Mujiko was releasing, and I wrote an analysis thread talking about its representation of DID. It was spread all over the internet, translated into multiple languages, and even reposted by the director of the show. Since then, I've been talking about my experiences a lot more, and for this year's EmblemCon, I decided I wanted to take the conversation to one of my favorite game series of all time. And so, I'm going to talk about plurality in the context of Fire Emblem. Before we can get into that, I have a lot of explaining to do. I imagine there are quite a few people here who don't know what I'm talking about at all, so let's go over some basics. First and foremost, what exactly is plurality? Plurality refers to having more than one self-aware entities or identities living within a single brain or body. This can manifest in a lot of different ways, but the general idea is that a group of alters live in a system together and go through life as many in one. There are 4 important terms to cover here: alter, system, fronting, and switching. Alter refers to any of the one identities shared within the brain and body. System refers to the collective of all of the identities brought together. Fronting refers to one of the alters taking control of the body, and switching refers to the alter who is fronting changing. These words will come up a lot throughout the presentation, so be sure to remember them. The most well-known form of plurality is dissociative identity disorder, otherwise known as DID. DID is a dissociative disorder that stems from trauma in early childhood. Every child has different emotional states when they are young, such as a state for hunger, a state for happiness, and so on. As the child grows older, these different pieces all start to come together to form a single identity. The fragments are no longer distinctive and merge into what we now know as a personality. However, this process of natural development is interrupted when a child experiences trauma at a young age. The different pieces of a child's mind are not just for hunger or happiness anymore. They are different aspects necessary for survival. The child cannot survive what they are going through so long as they remember it, and their brain begins to dissociate. Dissociation is the detachment of a person's mind from their body or from their reality, and it is a common coping mechanism in response to trauma and stress. With enough dissociation, these different pieces end up separated from one another by barriers of memory loss or amnesia. These pieces develop in a separate but parallel way, eventually becoming alters. There are a lot of symptoms for DID. The first and most prominent is shifts in identity that go beyond just a person being multifaceted. These alterations in personality run deep, and they are not sides of one person, but rather separate identities. These switches also come with amnesia, and people tend to suffer significantly from memory loss as a result. Both of these symptoms come from dissociation. Dissociation creates the alters and then causes memory disturbances between them. People with DID often report hearing voices, losing hours of time in dissociation, detachment from reality, and lack of connection with themselves. Lastly, it is common for DID systems to suffer from severe post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, because of their histories. There are a lot of misunderstandings about DID, and I'm going to try and clear up the most common ones here. First, some of you are probably thinking about multiple personality disorder. This was the old name for what is now DID, and it is horrifically out of date. MPD as a name has been out of diagnostic materials for over 30 years now, and it really should not have stuck around in people's minds for as long as it has. MPD is the same thing as DID, but our understandings of the disorder have improved. DID is not a personality disorder, it's caused by dissociation. The root of the quote-unquote multiple personalities is dissociation at the end of the day. So please stop calling it multiple personality disorder. That has not been accurate for a very long time. Speaking of that, another misconception is that alters are personalities. That isn't the case at all. In the most strict of medical terms, they are alternate pieces of the self that have been dissociated away. Also, a lot of us find it highly offensive to call us personalities. Alter is the correct clinical word for it. It's also worth noting that there's no limit to how many alters a system can have. There can only be a handful or dozens of them. It just depends on the system, and everyone is different. When a lot of people hear about systems, they immediately assume everyone suffers from blackout amnesia. A lot of media shows DID in a very dramatized way that isn't accurate to reality at all. Amnesia isn't as simple as a person blacking out and waking up somewhere completely different. Oftentimes, it's a lot more subtle than that. Systems know how to be covert and hide themselves, including from those who are in it. This means having plausible deniability to cover up amnesia. Some systems do experience full blackouts, but it is a relatively rare experience, and it doesn't mean someone doesn't have DID just because their amnesia is a bit less noticeable. A lot of people experience what has been dubbed grey-out amnesia, where memories slowly fade away. You don't notice you're forgetting in the moment, but you do when you reflect back on it. Amnesia isn't as cut and dry as media makes it out to be. One of the biggest misconceptions is that DID is rare. That is not the case at all. At its lowest predicted prevalence rate, DID is found in 1% of the population. If you look at the global population, this is twice as much as the population of Canada. At its highest predicted prevalence of 3%, DID is more common than being Brazilian. On top of that, DID is thought to be massively underdiagnosed because it takes an average of 7 to 12 years to get a diagnosis after entering the mental health system. Clinicians just aren't trained to see DID, so patients who have it are glossed over and don't get the care they need. DID is a covert disorder, and it hides itself from those who have it, making it harder for them to get help. DID isn't rare at all. A proper diagnosis is the really rare thing here. A lot of people also unfortunately believe that systems are fake. They think it sounds too outlandish and therefore that it cannot be real. Others assume it's an online trend and dismiss it outright because of that. I can assure you that it absolutely is real, and this has been proven many times over. On that note, no, you cannot tell if a system is faking. Claiming someone is faking has become a very common and very horrible trend on the internet within the last few years, and it absolutely needs to die out. Calling people cringe and fake helps no one, but does harm systems who are struggling with one of the most stigmatized disorders out there. And last but not least, we have the final and perhaps most prominent misconception, that people with DID are dangerous. DID forms because of trauma, and people with it are a lot more likely to end up victimized by abuse than to perpetrate it. No system secretly has a serial killer alter who is going to get you. That's a trope in Hollywood that does not apply to real life. Everything is fine, you are safe, and people with DID deserve to be treated like people just like anyone else. With the dense clinical stuff out of the way, I want to explain why I'm using the word plurality in this presentation specifically. The reason for that is simple. There are a lot of characters in the series who I think fit the description of having more than one identity in one body, but they don't fit all of the details of DID, like early childhood trauma, known dissociation issues, and so on. That is the reason I am also talking about possession in this presentation. A lot of characters who could be considered systems have that narrative coding because of possession. So my goal is to explore the characters who could be systems while distinguishing them from those that are simply possessed. With that said, it's time to define possession. There's a lot less detail to get into here. Possession, as I am defining it here, is when an outside presence intrudes upon someone's mind or body. There are a lot of different ways this manifests in Fire Emblem. Godly forces, dark magic, mysterious deities, and so on. However, possession and plurality are obviously not the same thing. There are a lot of systems out there who feel like they are possessed, but the actual explanation is very different. Possession in Fire Emblem involves otherworldly forces and magic, making it starkly different from alters in real life. In some cases, Fire Emblem characters will be possessed, but I still feel like they are written in a way that reads as a system. So how in the world am I going to be telling them apart? I have two primary criteria for this. First and foremost, is the possession recurrent? Does the character go in and out of being possessed, or are they possessed once, snap out of it, and it never happens again? If the possession reoccurs, then I am much more likely to say they are a system. Second, do the inhabitants of the single body in question communicate with one another? If they can talk to each other, then I am again a lot more likely to say they are a system. Those who fit both criteria are probably going to be called out here. There are some characters who might not fit these criteria, but I think of them as systems anyway, and that's because they seem like systems without any possession getting involved. I'll talk about those cases in more detail when we get there. First of all, though, I want to talk about the structure for the rest of this presentation. I'm going to be going through the series in roughly chronological order, starting with the possessions and then working my way into the plurality. I'll be focusing almost entirely on mainline games with one exception. Three Hopes. Since Three Hopes is tied so directly to Three Houses and even contains notable evidence for some of my points, I think it's necessary to include here. I will also have a few quotes from Fire Emblem Heroes here, but I won't be talking about any characters originating from Heroes. There's more than enough to bite off and chew on even without them. There are going to be spoilers for every game in the mainline series today, along with Three Hopes, so be warned. I've sorted all of the characters I'm discussing here today into tropes found throughout the series. I think my criteria for saying if someone is or is not a system will make more sense when I give an example, so we're going to kick things off by talking about a common possession trope. This one does not fit either one of my criteria, so I think it's a good example of what we are not looking for when making distinctions here. I'm hoping this will give you a better understanding of what in Fire Emblem could be considered plurality versus what probably isn't. Also, everything from here on out is based on my personal interpretations, so if you have different opinions, then that's completely fine. I just aim to give a framework for people to decide for themselves what is actually quote-unquote multiple personalities and what is one personality that is being possessed. I'll also be giving my opinions on if something is good representation or not, along with my reasoning for the verdict if it is plural. Without further ado, let's get into it after a quick water break, because I'm recording this all in one take. It's the spirit of the con, baby. Refreshing. The first trope I'm going to be talking about today is a very common one from Fire Emblem's earliest days, the possessed girl trope. This is very common in the games made by Shozo Kaga, the series creator. He left Intelligent Systems after the 5th game in the franchise, but for the first few years of Fire Emblem's history, this trope was everywhere. In the first game, Tiki was possessed, and you recruited her by snapping her out of her trance. Delthea's mind is taken over by dark forces until she is defeated and brought into Alm's army. The Witches of Valentia are girls who were possessed by dark magic. Celica is forced to fight Alm against her will. The Clerics of Arcanea being possessed in Mystery of the Emblem was one of the most prominent plot points in the game. Julia's mind is taken over by Manfroy. Marita loses control of herself to the Shadow Sword. There are a lot of girls who get possessed in the first few Fire Emblem games and their remakes. This is a very popular trope of possession in the series, and while it doesn't show up much in subsequent games, its presence in the first third of the franchise is more than enough to cement it as important. This category of characters, however, falls entirely into the category of possession and not plurality. The characters are possessed once, snap out of it, and then do not end up in that situation again. The exception here is the witches from Echoes, who never snap out of it, but I still don't think that really counts here because of the second criteria. These characters do not communicate with their regular selves when they are possessed. There are traces of who they normally are, yes, but they are not talking about someone else as much as they are talking about a different version of themselves. There is one person being taken over by the forces of darkness here. It does not reoccur, there is no internal communication, so it is not plurality. However, there is something else worth discussing here, the misogyny behind this trope. While there are men who do get possessed in the earlier Fire Emblem games, it is on a much smaller scale. The men who are possessed tend to have way more sway on the narrative, and there aren't recruits of male characters where you have to knock them out of their possession in order to get them to join your team. Beyond that, it is often men who put these possessed girls in their situations in the first place. Garneth is the one who possesses Tiki. Jeddah manipulates Celica. Manfroy pulls Julia's strings. The girls who are possessed lose a lot of their autonomy, and it is a position male characters are not put in. This trope faded away after Thracia 776, and I think that was a good thing. While other girls do get possessed in the series going forward, it's handled very differently in the narrative and isn't a one-chapter gimmick. In short, this is not plurality. It's just possession, and in my opinion, it's one of the weakest presentations of possession in the series. I'm glad this one has died out with time and been replaced with other tropes that have a bit less sexist baggage. For our next trope, we're going to stay in the first 5 Fire Emblem games. I mentioned a minute ago that some men end up possessed in these earliest games in the series, and this category is dedicated specifically to the possessed antagonists from the first few games and their remakes. We're talking specifically about Hardin, Berkut, and Julius here. All 3 of them are very impactful on the plot of the games they originate in. Hardin is the driving force behind the events of Mystery of the Emblem and its remake. Julius is a major antagonist in Genealogy of the Second War's second half. Genealogy of the Holy War's second half. Excuse me. Berkut is only possessed for a brief time, but he is around long before then. All three of these characters have a very similar source of possession, a dark god or similarly strong evil power. In search of power or out of despair and desperation, they turn to the cruelest deities in their continents. Berkut sacrifices his soul to Duma, Julius is taken over by Loptus, and Hardin is consumed by the Dark Sphere because of Garneff's desire to revive Medius. These possessions are all one-and-done deals, and the characters do not show any signs of having these symptoms when they are not possessed. It happens once, and in most cases is permanent because of their deaths, and there is no communication. So it's safe to say that this is not an example of plurality. It is, however, absolutely possession. During the previous section, I talked about how the girls of the first 5 games were possessed fairly frequently for the sake of smaller plot points. Now, I want to contrast that with how the possessions of men are treated in the same games. Hardin is the main antagonist of the third Fire Emblem game. He is taken over because he loses himself to despair after realizing Nina does not truly love him. Berkut is another major antagonist who willingly gives up his and Renea's souls for the sake of gaining the power to defeat Ulm. Julius's possession has a lot more staying power than the equivalent in Yggdrasil 2, and it's a very significant plot point that cannot be overlooked. There's a very notable difference and imbalance between how the men are possessed for the larger narrative and because they crave power of some kind, as opposed to how the women are possessed, by men for the sake of often brief plot lines. There hasn't been this much of a disparity in possession gender ever since the first 5 Fire Emblem games, and I absolutely think that's for the best. I know the point of this presentation is to examine if these tropes make for good representation of plurality, but I couldn't help wanting to talk about it through another lens of representation too. I'm glad the gender difference has grown a lot less stark in recent years. I think it makes the possessions from here on out a lot more nuanced, and more importantly, lacking in potentially misogynistic undertones. For our next category, we're finally taking a step out of the first 5 Fire Emblem games and into some new territory. Well, sort of. This next category has to do with possessed dragons specifically. To be honest with you, these characters are all unique cases, but I wasn't entirely sure where to put them in terms of categories, so I decided to bunch them all here. Consider this a miscellaneous category where everything just so happens to involve dragons because Fire Emblem loves its dragons. The 3 characters I'm going to be talking about here are Luin, Idun, and Ninian. All 3 of these possessions are sort of one-of-a-kind cases for some reason or another. Idun is a possessed antagonist, but it didn't feel right putting her in the last category because there's no misogyny to talk about with her specifically, or at least not the same kind of misogyny. Ninian is technically a possessed girl, but again, the circumstances are different than the previous category. And Luin, well, he's Luin. Idun was a dragon originally born with a soul, but it was taken away from her when she was made into the living weapon known as the Demon Dragon. This is similar enough to possession that I believe I can fit it here for the purposes of this presentation. Ninian's quote-unquote possession of sorts involves her succumbing to her draconic instincts and losing all of her memories. Much like Idun, she loses the core of herself because of it. Ninian is also pushed into this position by Nurgle, though he doesn't directly possess her necessarily. As for Luin, he is possessed by a dragon in the second half of Genealogy of the Holy War. A special epilogue reveals that Luin was not present in the second generation at all. Instead, he was taken over by Forseti, the dragon connected with his bloodline after dying at the Battle of Valhalla. The real Luin's soul is long gone, but his body has been a puppet of Forseti since his passing. All 3 of these I am considering strictly possession. For Idun, she loses her soul for a very long time, but she does regain it in the true ending of Binding Blade. After the fact, there are no signs of these symptoms reoccurring. Ninian only loses herself when she turns into her dragon form, and otherwise she is fine. Lastly, Luin's possession only happens in death, making it outright impossible for him to communicate with Forseti after he is taken over. In fact, that leads very cleanly into our next category about this specific topic, but this time we're talking about the dead coming back as villains. The idea of the dead coming back to life is hardly an uncommon trope. You can find it in all sorts of places across all sorts of media. It makes quite a few appearances in Fire Emblem 2, where the trope manifests as the dead being brought back to life to fight against the main army. Characters who were fought in the past return for one last battle. If they were not fought during the game directly, then they were at least important to the narrative in the time they were alive. Blazing Blade's final chapter brings back multiple members of the Black Fang to fight as phantoms during the battle against Nurgle. Revelation revives the deceased Sumeragi, Mikoto, and Dorit to fight against Corrin's army. Engage brings back Lumera, for one emotional farewell battle with Alir. In each of these cases, though, the revived dead are not in full control. They have been taken over by dark forces, like Nurgle, Anankos, or Sombron, meaning they are not themselves at all. This trope is definitively a possession. This cannot happen more than once because the characters are dead. Once they are defeated again, their bodies waste away fully, and there is no chance for it to happen again. Beyond that, not a single one of these characters shows signs of having multiple sides in life. There is no communication between the regular form of the character and the fallen form because that would be impossible. The regular version of the character had to die in order for them to be revived. We're going to have to look a little bit longer if we want to find representation of systems, I'm afraid. This trope is a very interesting one, though, and it's always very intriguing when it shows up. Water. Tellius is a bit of a strange one here. There are two different types of possession that are found only in these two games. As such, I have decided to quarantine Tellius in its own section to talk about them. First, we have the characters influenced by Leiron's medallion. When it comes to what we see on screen, that would only be Ashnard. Grail was impacted by it in the past, though, and Heroes gives Ike an alternate version based on this concept. I know I said I wasn't going to include spin-offs like Heroes, but since there's not much information about this in the games, I had to rely on it a little bit. This one has a pretty cut and dry answer for if it's plurality or not. No. This only happens when the characters are touching the medallion, and it ends when they stop holding it. One of the criteria for diagnosing DID is that the symptoms can't show up strictly because of substances. If you only have it when you're high, then you're not going to get the diagnosis. So, think of Leiron's medallion as a substance. These are not systems. That's just a possession. There's something else to do with the medallion that's a little bit different, but we're going to put a pin in that and then come back to it later. The other Tellius possession of sorts is the feral drug. When given to people, it causes them to lose their minds and think of nothing but combat and bloodshed. This is seen with both Renning and Morim in Radiant Dawn, and countless unnamed Lagoos throughout both Tellius games. Once again, this is a very cut and dry case, and it is not plurality. Just like the medallion, this is the introduction of a substance. Though this time it's actually a substance instead of a metaphorical one. Renning shows no signs of still having traces of Bertram inside of him after he has returned to normal. Morim's particularly violent impulses fade as soon as Raphael purifies him. It does not reoccur, there is no communication, so it's just possession. Tellius has very interesting takes on possession-based tropes, and I really love them. But maybe I'm just biased because the Tellius games are my favorite. Who could say for sure? The next trope has existed in some form or another ever since the dawn of the series. Someone who is possessed not because they are taken over by another person, but because their own power corrupts them. Even though it's a little bit different from the traditional definition of possession, I'm choosing to mention it here because I think it's similar enough. There are a lot of examples here, but the vast majority of them come from the dragons across the series losing control of their power. The Earth Dragons from Arcanea, Mila and Duma from Valentia, Corrin and Anankos from Fates, Rhea from Three Houses, and so on. Nurgle also falls into this category in his own way, I suppose, though he's a bit of an outlier compared to the rest of the dragons present here. This possession is brought on by the characters completely losing touch with their humanity. The ancient dragons of Arcanea could only preserve their sanity if they transformed into humanoid forms and started to use dragonstones. Those that did not began to suffer from notable deterioration as time went by. The same applies to both Duma and Mila the next continent over. The downward spiral of Valentia was marked by them losing control of their power, and they eventually passed on because they completely lost themselves. Anankos and Vala deteriorated with time too, and eventually destroyed part of the country. Corrin lashed out in grief because of the death of their mother in the prologue of Fates. Rhea loses control of her draconic abilities at the end of Silver Snow. Nurgle pushed the powers of darkness to their very limits and then lost himself. In some way or another, all of these characters took a significant turn for the worst, brought on by their own abilities. There was only so much they could do to fight it before they caved in beneath it all. This is yet another trope that I think is strictly affiliated with possession. There's no communication between the different sides of these characters when they lose control of themselves. In most cases, the characters deteriorate, reach the point of no return, and then never go back to the way they were before. So it only ever happens once, and in a lot of cases, it leads to their deaths. Corrin survives this spiral, but once again, they show no signs of this behavior returning again. It is a deep corruption, so tragically it ends in defeat and death for the majority of those who succumb to it. I do want to give a small little asterisk here for Anankos. You could make a case for Anankos here, but because of his quote-unquote good side, I suppose, being completely split apart from his draconic side, I really don't think it applies because they're treated as two entirely separate entities after that point and not two entities in the same body. They've got different bodies. That's the logic here. Our next category is one that I am calling the return of the possessed antagonist. This category is for any other villain that ends up being possessed for some reason or another, usually by an outside force. I decided to separate this group from the previous batch of possessed foes because of the different places they appear in the series lineup. The first group of possessed major villains was meant to be a direct comparison to girls who were possessed in that same era, so this time we're talking about antagonists that have no such counterparts. We're specifically covering possessions in the games of Awakening and Fates, and there are 4 of them: Morgan, Takumi, Gunter, and Garen. Morgan is the only character here from Awakening. The 2 versions of Morgan are both possessed by Grima during the Future Past DLC connected to Awakening. The 2 versions of Morgan have their memories manipulated and pushed by Grima to convince them to attack the people they were once close with, the other children of the Awakening cast. One of them is Robin's child, depending on the gender of the player character on that file, while the other Morgan was brought in from another world with Grima's power. The influence Grima has over them qualifies as possession to me, even if it's a bit different from other cases. I don't think of this as plurality, though. They managed to break out of Grima's hold in the end, and their relationship with Grima isn't what I would call potentially plural. Put another pin in that, though, because we're going to come back to the subject of Grima a little bit later on. The Fates characters are a bit more cut and dry here. All 3 of them are taken over by Anankos under different circumstances. Takumi's hatred of Korin leads to him being possessed, and Azura snaps him out of it in Birthright, but in Conquest, Takumi is driven all the way to the edge and eventually dies. Garen is already dead by the time Anankos fully takes him over, and his control holds strong until Garen is defeated by the main cast for the final time. Gunter becomes Anankos' puppet in Revelation, only snapping out of it when he is defeated in battle. After Takumi and Gunter manage to escape their possessions, they never show any signs of communicating with Anankos like this again. It doesn't reoccur, and without communication, I'm disqualifying it from the category of plurality. In Garen's case, since he was already dead, there was no communication that could happen in the first place. It would have been impossible for it to happen again, too, because he was dead when it started. So our next batch of possessed antagonists ends up getting the same response as the previous group. None of them are getting classified as plural here. They are possessed, but not plural. And with that, I believe we have gone through all of the tropes in Fire Emblem that I think are strictly possessions. I didn't realize it until I started doing research and writing this for this presentation and script, but there are a lot of different types of possession over the course of the series, and we haven't even covered all of them. For our next section, we're going to be moving into what I have dubbed the complicated category. It refers to characters who I think are definitely possessed in some way or another, but there's a bit more nuance to it. Going back to the 2 criteria I listed at the start of the presentation, these characters are the ones who fit the rules. Their possession reoccurs in some form or another, and there are signs of communication between the 2 residents of the same body. There are traces of one even when the other is present once the possession happens for the first time. There may not have been symptoms before this happens, but it happens enough after the first possession that it feels notable. This is definitely still possession in some form or another, but I think of it as a Venn diagram. This next group sits in the middle of the 2 circles between possession and plurality, and they're the first ones I'm considering as having system potential. Before we get into all of that, though, I want to reiterate that all of this is strictly based on my interpretations. Other people who play the games may view these situations differently, and everyone is entitled to their own opinions. I'm not trying to say that I'm undeniably right and everyone else is just wrong. These are just my readings of the characters, and I'm hoping you'll find them a little bit interesting. From here on out, I'm going to be giving my opinions on if these characters and situations are good representations of plurality or not. Systems don't tend to receive the best representation, and certain negative tropes are certainly prominent in various genres of storytelling. So I'm going to break down if these portrayals have any negative stereotype baggage behind them or not. Again, it's just my opinion, so if you disagree, then you're more than welcome to. Even so, I'm hoping you'll listen to my perspectives and then come to your own conclusions. With all of that preliminary rambling out of the way, let's get to the complicated middle ground between possessions and plurality. After another water break. This script is 20 pages long. The first character to discuss here is one I bet a lot of you have been waiting for. Leon. This is... or Lion? Leon? However you want to say it. This is one of the most famous possessions in the entire series because of the impact it has on Sacred Stones, and personally, I think there's a little bit more to it than meets the eye. This possession fulfills both of the criteria I set out earlier in the presentation. First, it does happen more than once. Even after accepting Fomortis, Lion comes in and out of control. Sometimes Fomortis is completely in control, but in others there still seems to be traces of Lion. Fomortis talks about Lion fighting against him a few times, and in Heroes, the dialogue for Fomortis implies he and Lion are able to communicate with one another to some extent. Depending on the root of sacred stones, Lion is either manipulated and corrupted by Fomortis or has his body stolen from him. Either way, it fulfills the two criteria I set out at the start, making this the first case I think has potential to be called a system. Now for the next question. Is this great representation of plurality? Personally, I don't think it's fantastic. One of the biggest tropes in fiction to do with systems is the idea of an evil alter, someone within the system who takes over the body to do awful things and hurt people. In the horror genre, this often manifests as a serial killer. Given the fact that Fomortis is an evil god, I don't think this was ever meant to be good representation, though. It wasn't even intended to be plurality. I think this is a case of a possession being written to just be a possession, but since it fulfills my two rules, there's room for discussion about it being something here, and that's why I'm talking about it now. Rather than go through the series chronologically for the next bit, I want to go to a very similar case to Lion, Robin and Grima. Once again, this has a mage being taken over by an evil dragon god that wishes to destroy the world. This time, though, we see it happen in real time instead of it being relegated to something off-screen from a different perspective. Throughout Awakening, Grima makes multiple efforts to take over Robin's body after traveling through time. Robin fights him off, but another version of them fails to keep Grima from taking them over. There is a bit of communication between Robin and Grima here, even if it is not extensive. The fact that Robin comes in and out of it in the current timeline of Awakening is also relevant. I think the most interesting detail of all of this, though, is the fact that Robin and Grima do not share memories. It is very common for alters in a system to struggle to share memories and experiences with one another because of the barriers that exist between them. Grima's quotes in Heroes talk a lot about how he would be unstoppable if he could only remember, but he can never quite seem to make something out of it. There are traces of Robin peering through in Heroes too, with the words of someone who wishes to be human and live among other people. This possession is a lot more complex than it seems on the surface. Even with that in mind, though, I don't think this was intentionally written to be representation of plurality. I think this was meant to be just another possession, and that is honestly for the best. Honestly, reading this as a system situation leads to the same problems I expressed with Leon about Grima coming off as an evil alter. This stereotype does a lot of damage and is one of the biggest reasons systems are thought to be dangerous by the uninformed. So I don't think this is a great example of a system, but since the traces are here, it's worth discussing. I don't think it's the most harmful thing in the world either, since it wasn't intentional, and it can still be read as a regular possession if you prefer. It just depends on personal interpretation. Now it's time to backtrack and talk about my favorite possession in this category, Micaiah and Yune. Throughout Radiant Dawn, Micaiah communicates with Yune, the small bird who spends a lot of time perched on her shoulder. Micaiah is the only one who ever speaks to Yune, and there's a reason for that. In the final act of Radiant Dawn, Micaiah's body is taken over by Yune, the goddess of chaos who speaks to the rest of the world through Micaiah's lips. Yune takes charge of Micaiah's body quite a few times during cutscenes from this point onward, but it is not constant. In fact, Micaiah and Yune switch back and forth quite frequently depending on the circumstances, and Micaiah is always present during battles. Yune talks about Micaiah's feelings from her perspective, proof that the two of them can communicate. They care deeply about one another and get along very well. Given the fact that the switching also happens repeatedly, I think it's very obvious for what the verdict on this is going to end up being. And that is that it's good representation. I really appreciate that Yune isn't an evil god or anything similar for a wide variety of reasons. For one, it's interesting that the goddess of order is the antagonist of Radiant Dawn's finale. Secondly, it means Micaiah and Yune do not fall into the same holes Lion and Robin did. Yune is just another person, albeit one who is very childish. If you wanted to, you could view this as an example of an alter having a different age from the body, something that is extremely common in systems. This representation isn't perfect though, and a lot of people have criticized this plot point for taking the focus away from Micaiah in her own game. I think this is a valid critique, and I wish there was a bit more balance between them two. In terms of system representation though, it's doing a pretty good job, and there's a reason this is one of my favorite dynamics in the entire series. The last character in this category is Vale from Engage. Normally, Vale is kind and curious, seeking to explore the world and find happiness. However, all of that changes when she is put under a possession spell by Zephyia. All of a sudden, Vale is sadistic and cruel, her eyes turning bright red. The regular Vale has very few memories of what her other side does when in control, but her red-eyed persona knows all about what she does. The two do not get along at all. The red-eyed Vale wants to take over completely and destroy her purple-eyed counterpart. The purple-eyed Veil, on the other hand, is utterly horrified at what her other half does when she learns of it. This possession also happens multiple times, and since the two can communicate, albeit very minimally, it does fit the criteria I set out for this section. But is it good representation? Unfortunately, not really. I will say that I appreciate the other goals they gave to the Red-Eyed Veil and how she strives for more. In-system conflict like this is not only possible, but realistic, since not all alters are guaranteed to get along. However, we once again have the problem of having a serial killer alter. That's pretty common with these cases, isn't it? However, this does get a few extra points because it isn't a matter of an evil god possessing someone. For some extra positives, Vale suffers from pretty notable trauma from being raised by Sombron, and if you wanted to, you could interpret that as the cause of this, especially with the unique desires of her other side. If you really wanted to, I bet you could write this in a way that would have better, and that would read better for system interpretation. Maybe I'll have to do that one day. It's been on my to-do list for a very long time, but I just haven't done it. It sounds fun though, so I'll give it that. For this next category, we're going to talk about the cases of characters where I just think they're a system. There's no possession shenanigans in this one, they just seem like they have alters to me, plain and simple. None of the games outright say that they're systems on account of the time period, but it still comes through to me. Since DID and other diagnoses like it obviously did not exist in the medical times that Fire Emblem games take place in, we're just going to have to read into it a little. There are three characters that I put into this category, so without further ado, let's get right to them. The first of the trio here is Noir from Awakening. Noir's personality quirk in the game is that she has two sides, a timid one and an aggressive one. She flips back and forth between the two on a dime, going from talking softly to someone to shouting at them in a matter of seconds. Other characters are often caught by surprise by the sudden shift, especially when she returns to her shy state again just as quickly. The aggressive side often emerges in response to stress, something common in switches and DID systems. Protective alters surface in times of duress. In the game, this is explained by Noir having a talisman made by Tharja that brings out a louder side of herself. With the way the rest of the situation reads, though, I still feel like there are some system shenanigans happening here. There are some hints that imply Noir developed this other side of herself as a coping mechanism, and considering what DID tends to come from, that explanation makes a lot more sense to me. It's not uncommon for systems to have supernatural beliefs about their alters prior to discovery. They feel like they are possessed, performing, or particularly imaginative since they don't have the language to articulate their experiences. Through this lens, the talisman could be interpreted as Noir and Tharja's way of explaining what they do not understand. Speaking of Tharja, she is the reason all of this happens in the first place. In the ruined future of Awakening, Tharja uses Noir as a test subject for her experiments of magic. Noir is desperate to get away from the test and often pleads for her father to intervene and rescue her. This more than qualifies as the childhood trauma that DID stems from, and it would explain Noir's eccentricities perfectly. Noir shows signs of a lot of other trauma responses too. She wishes female Robin was her mother instead of Tharja during their supports, and Noir often jumps immediately to blaming herself for issues that are even entirely unrelated to her. Hero's quotes reveal that Noir has flashbacks of what Tharja did to her in the past too. Noir cannot control it when she loses control of herself, as is revealed in her supports with Laurent. There's a lot of evidence supporting this theory, and it only goes deeper the longer you look. So, what's the verdict? Is Noir good representation? I think that's up to personal interpretation. On one hand, I'm glad Noir's other side isn't quite an evil alter. That other half of her doesn't take particular pleasure from hurting and killing people. She threatens people often, but she's not a serial killer or anything. Still, I can understand why people would be put off by that. I think my answer here is somewhere in the middle. On one hand, it gets the trauma aspect of DID very right, and it makes a lot of sense for Noir narratively. On the other hand, it is pretty dramatic, and it could be interpreted in a very negative light. So I think everyone should come to their own conclusions about this. Personally, I like Noir and enjoy her as a character while acknowledging her weak points, but I couldn't fault anyone for feeling otherwise. For our next entry, we move conveniently to the next game of the series to find Perry. There was a little bit less here in terms of explicit evidence, but there was still enough for me to notice it when playing through Conquest. Perry, much like Noir, has two sides to her personality. On one hand, she is childish and prone to throwing tantrums, and on the other, she is brutal and violent. Unlike Noir, these two sides of Perry exist a bit more closely, and there don't seem to be many barriers between them. Perry is stated to be like this because of a tragic history. Her mother was killed by a servant when she was young, and Perry walked in on the scene afterward. Perry's mind is said to have shattered because of this trauma, and she was stuck permanently in a childish mentality and developed a violent streak. Since DID stems from trauma, this would make sense as the starting point of something for Perry mentally. Perry reacts to triggers, such as combat or seeing a servant, and lets out her violent side accordingly. In theory, that makes her somewhat similar to Noir. But unlike Noir, I really don't think Perry makes for good representation. There's a bit less backing for this idea than Noir, and I doubt it was intentional, but it definitely can come off as an evil alter situation. Perry has one side who acts like a child, and this can be somewhat accurate to real systems. A lot of systems have alters who present as children and behave considerably younger than the body actually is. But the other side of her is violent and kills people for the sake of it, the very stereotype that fuels most stigma around DID in the first place. Even if you think this reading of Perry is a stretch, it's not uncommon to see people online refer to her as having a split personality. That term is thought of very negatively in system spaces because it misunderstands what being a system is like. Alters aren't just personalities, they're people. The fact that Perry's characterization brings up responses like this tells me everything I need to know about how most people view her. There are a lot of connections in the way people read about a childish character with a penchant for murder and the sensationalized serial killer DID movies shown in theaters. It's a little too uncomfortably close for my liking, so even if it isn't as explicit as Noir, I still think it belongs here. I still feel the need to clarify that this is not representative of real life, because she evokes the same reactions as other ableist interpretations of systems. Even if a lot of people disagree with this reading and never thought of Perry this way, the fact remains that some people did, and this feeds negative stigma around systems. So I don't think Perry is a good representative of system life at all in her current iteration. Sorry, Perry. If you didn't want to kill people so badly, then maybe we wouldn't be here. However, I will say that I do think it would be possible to improve all of this with a little bit of rewriting. I don't have time to get into all of those details here, but I think there is a chance it would be better if there was a little bit more awareness going into the writing process. For the last character in this batch, we have Alir. I bet you didn't see that one coming. The past version of Alir was the child of the fell dragon Sombron, and they acted very different to the one we know in the present. They were jaded and quiet, numb to the world and to the trauma that came with losing so many of their siblings in the war. However, they began to change upon meeting Lumera. She brought light into their life for the first time, and Alir's hardened heart began to soften. Unfortunately, Alir nearly died shortly afterward, and Lumera had to intervene to save their life. When Alir awoke next, they had forgotten all memories of their past, and their personality completely changed. I personally read this as a different alter taking control while the previous one fell into a deep sleep. This is very possible in real-life systems too, and it is known as dormancy. While the situation is a little bit different here, I still view it as nice representation. Alir is clearly a very traumatized person before being taken in by Lumera, and they are a shell of themselves in the chapter set in the past. In the game, Alir's current personality comes from having their memories wiped, but I still think there's room for a plural interpretation. It was the first thing that popped into my head while playing the game, and I did confirm this with other people that they also felt the exact same way. While we don't see much of Alir's past self, I still think there's enough backing to consider it. And beyond that, I think it's nice to have a villainous character like Alir's past self have nuance in ways that other characters do not. Alir does a better job of avoiding the evil alter stereotype than Perry, and I don't think anyone saw that coming based on the early cutscenes in the game of past Alir. For our last leg of the journey here today, we have 3 houses. I'm sure quite a few of you were wondering when I was going to mention 3 houses over the last 2 categories, and the answer is right here. 3 houses has a whopping 5 examples for us to talk about. Since this game is the only one to have so many, I decided to go on and put them all together. It just felt the most convenient way to discuss it because no other game has this much to discuss in terms of blatant examples of plurality. So without further ado, let's get into these examples, starting off with my personal least favorite of the bunch. Out of the 5 examples to discuss for 3 houses, my least favorite is ironically the most explicit one, Yuritsa. 3 houses doesn't really beat around the bush with Yuritsa. He was born as Emil, the heir of House Bartels. Life there was traumatizing and trying. At a glance, this seems like it's off to a good start, until you learn about the altar. The other identity in Yuritsa's body is the Death Knight. That's not just a persona he dons when he enters a battle. He has an altar in his head who wants nothing other than to kill people. The Death Knight's first appearance came when he learned his father planned to pursue and wed Mercedes against her will. Emile blacked out, the Death Knight killed everyone at House Bartels, and Emile came to at the sight of the slaughter, once it was all over. Edelgard helped Emile to start over as Yaritza, but the Death Knight remained, and the Death Knight continued to want to kill people for the sake of it. There are a lot of red flags here. The first and most obvious is that systems are not serial killers. The Death Knight murdering people just isn't realistic, and it feeds into the evil altar stigma I have mentioned so many times before now. Systems aren't inherently dangerous, but the Death Knight certainly makes them seem like it. The fact that Yaritza fully blacks out when the Death Knight is in control is a little bit suspect too. Blackout amnesia isn't all that common in real life. It still happens, of course, but when it is utilized right next to a serial killer stereotype, yeah, the result isn't anything good. There are virtually no traits to the Death Knight persona other than wanting to kill more and more people. It's damaging in a lot of ways, and I really don't like the way the character was handled at all. I really do think a character like this could have been interesting in the setting of Three Houses, but the Death Knight just isn't the way to go about it. We have one other example I don't particularly like before we move on to the stuff I actually do. This one is going to sound a little bit strange, but I want to talk about Edelgard specifically in the context of Three Hopes. We're looking at the Azure Gleam route in particular here because Edelgard has a very strange role in the route. Partway through the story, Edelgard is forcibly transformed into her hegemon form, and that is where the problems begin. When she reverts back to her human form, her mind has been completely altered. She is now meek and almost hollow, staring off into space and saying very little. She acts the way a traumatized child would, and that's why it caught my attention. Edelgard only ever does exactly as she is told in this state, and it is beyond unsettling. It could be stated that this is magic of some kind, but something about the writing here has always felt bizarre to me. Why does this only happen on this one route? Edelgard turns into her hegemon form in Three Houses too, but she doesn't act like this after being defeated. The writing choice caught a lot of attention from fans, and it certainly caught me by surprise too, but for all the wrong reasons. I'm sure some of you are wondering what this has to do with the plurality topic I'm discussing here. Well, because Edelgard acts so much younger than she usually does, I think there's room to argue this is a younger alter taking control. In cases of notable trauma, such as what Edelgard went through at the hands of those who slither in the dark, some alters may be completely compliant to their abusers. That would fit the description here, if you ask me. In theory, this is an interesting idea, but the way it is implemented has never sat well with me. This only happens in one route, and it takes away Edelgard's autonomy completely. We know the Edelgard of the present is still in there somewhere too, because she resurfaced during the special chapters about Arval near the end of the game. After leaving that other dimension, though, she returned to her regressed state. That means this is recurring, and she seems to have her memories tampered with when this happens, similar to what happens with the Switch. There are a lot of weird things to note here, and to me, it could be read as something plural. That doesn't mean I like it, though. The reasons are a bit harder to describe than with Yaritza and the Death Knight, but this plot point has always read as very uncomfortable. It reminds me a bit too much of the possessed girl trope from earlier in the series, one that I criticized for its underlying misogyny. This is the worst that trope has reared its head in a very long time, and I really do not like it. The worst part of it to me, though, is the very end of Azure Gleam, where during the final cutscene, it seems like Dimitri is considering mercy killing Edelgard. The way this scene is framed feels really, really uncomfortable, since mercy killing is something many disabled people have been subject to against their will. This possession, or whatever else you want to call it, takes away Edelgard's autonomy as the only leading woman of Three Houses. It echoes the issues of the possessed girl trope and has a lot of ableism just as a cherry on top. I don't like this at all, and I hope this little explanation gave you a good idea as to why. But okay, I promise I'm done being negative now. Our next example is one that I really, really like. Shez was one of my favorite characters in the series from the second I saw them in Three Hopes, and a massive reason for that is their dynamic with Arval. The two of them are so much fun. I love all of their banter, and I looked forward to all of the scenes they shared. Maybe that's because they are very system-coded to me. Shez talks to someone no one else can hear, spaces out when talking to them, and that other someone has a completely different personality. I think this is very on the nose. Sure, Arval might be an other-dimensional being, but it still comes off as a system. And it's a fun one, too! Shez and Arval are a real highlight of Three Hopes, and I love them both. Unfortunately, Three Hopes kind of trips at the final hurdle. In the optional Arval chapters near the end of each route, it comes out that Arval is secretly evil. Epimenides, Arval's creator, was an Agarthan who wanted to kill Sothis. To reach that goal, he created Arval and imbued them with his consciousness. Epimenides and Arval fused to try and kill Shez, Byleth, and the house leaders. These chapters are a bit jarring, honestly, and it's not just because of their odd placement in the story. Arval showed signs of being intense in the past, but they weren't ever like this. Epimenides existed silently in Shez's mind the entire time and then took over Arval to kill Byleth and Sothis. It's an unfortunate end to Arval's story since I thought it was a lot of fun before then. I will say, though, that I don't hold too much of this against the game. Three Hopes really felt like it was building up to DLC that never came to life, and I think that would have answered some of our questions here. As it stands, though, I think Shez and Arval are overall a net positive. They're both fun characters who bicker and banter the way I do with a lot of my alters. Arval can take control of Shez's body for switches, as is shown in those secret chapters, and they talk to each other all the time. They even have an internal world where they can communicate. If you ignore the way it ends, this is some of the most promising representation the series has ever had. Honestly, it's awesome, and it really makes me wish Three Hopes didn't fail the ending so badly. The next character set is pretty similar to Shez and Arval. Byleth and Sothis. They have a lot of the same positives Shez and Arval do. They talk internally, Byleth dissociates and spaces out when talking to Sothis, they have an inner world to communicate in, and so on. In Three Houses, Sothis' ultimate fate is that she fuses with Byleth to save them from Zaharas. This is something that happens in a lot of systems, actually. Sometimes two or more alters will combine into one, and this is known as fusion. And there are still signs of Sothis peering out after that. She talks to Byleth when they awaken after the time skip, for example, so even after fusion, Sothis is still there to some extent. Three Hopes has more interesting content for Byleth and Sothis, though it's a bit different now. For one, Sothis shows that she can take over Byleth's body, proving that the two of them are capable of switching. Another point in favor of them being plural. Sothis is a lot more hostile in this game, though. She threatens Byleth with taking over their body forcibly, eventually doing so permanently with the hope of avenging Gerald's death. The reason for this seems to stem from Sothis' hatred of Arval, the same thing that ultimately fueled Arval's turn for the worse. It's not haphazard murder, though, and it is focused only on Arval. Beyond that, Sothis' permanent takeover in Hope stems from Byleth's grief over Gerald's death, so you could read this as Sothis stepping forward to protect Byleth from hardship. I promise I can talk. As a whole, I have to say that I like Byleth and Sothis. They're really fun. Do I wish things were a bit less hostile between them in Hopes? Yes, but overall, I enjoy them. Last up on our list is the one and only Constance. She has two sides to her personality, depending on if she is in direct sunlight or not. Her dark side is dramatic, confident, and proud, but when Constance steps into the light, she loses the wind in her sails and grows timid and apologetic. The source of this seems to be the trauma of her losing her noble home in the Brigid Dagda War. Now, Constance is divided into two alters who both reoccur and seem to communicate with one another. At the very least, they talk about each other. While the two sides don't have their own names, they refer to one another as their other side. On top of that, the confident Constance tries to stay out of direct sunlight so she doesn't have to switch out. Wanting to stay in control is a pretty common struggle for systems, so this makes sense to me. And to finish on a strong note, I do think Constance is good representation. She is a bit dramatic, but I think she's fun. Neither one of her sides is ever portrayed as antagonistic or evil. They coexist, albeit with a bit of bickering, and live an otherwise regular life. Even if it is played up a little bit for the story, I think it works. Systems can live normal lives, and Constance is proof of it. Even though her situation is a bit less obvious than someone like Yuritsa, I find it to be a lot better on the representation front. Everyone should give Constance her flowers and then some. So, those are all the characters I wanted to cover for this presentation, so before we finish things up, I want to give a few closing thoughts. First, what do I think of the possessions across the series? Well, I think they're a lot more varied than I originally assumed. There's a lot to look at here in a lot of different categories. Fire Emblem is a series with a lot of possessions, but they do a good job of keeping things fresh with the way in which it presents. It's fascinating, and it's something I don't think most people would notice unless they looked really closely. I especially found it interesting just how much of an overlap there is between possessions and plurality. I think some people tend to confuse the two, and I had fun breaking down what I think makes them different even in middle ground cases. The variety is part of the fun, and I love reading things in new, inventive ways. What do I think of the current representation of systems in the series? I think there are some real winners here, though there are some pretty big losers at the same time. Characters like Perry and Yuritsa leave a pretty bad taste in my mouth, but Micaiah and Yune and Constance leave me with a smile. While there are some negative cases, there are some good ones too. It's not all good or bad, and that's okay with me. It means there's more to analyze and examine from a bunch of different angles. Where do I think the series is going from here in this regard? I'm not entirely sure. Yuritsa being from such a recent game doesn't inspire confidence, but Alir being from an even more recent game certainly does. I think in the future we can expect a bunch of things, just a mix of a bunch of things, just like we've seen throughout the series' history. I will say that I'm hoping for a character who is as explicit about it as Yuritsa without falling into negative stereotypes. I genuinely think the series is capable of doing that. Who knows? Maybe Fortune's Weave will be the game to fulfill my wildest dreams here. My final takeaway that I want to leave you all with is the very heart and soul of this presentation: interpretation. A lot of these readings of the characters are just personal thoughts of mine, and I want to inspire all of you to interpret your favorite characters and stories in new ways too. I hope I introduced all of you to at least one new reading of the series today, and maybe I even got you thinking about other ways to apply these same trains of thought. I think stories thrive when you're willing to look at them from new, inventive angles. Charge into things you never thought about before. Consider what you never did previously. Stories have endless potential as long as you're willing to see it, so go out there with your own new readings. Tell me how you feel about my interpretations. Go wild with it. This series is stronger when we're willing to give it more of our effort, and I know I had a blast doing that here today. And with that, we've reached the end of today's presentation. Thank you so much for coming, and I hope you enjoyed hearing about this topic. It's one I'm very passionate about, and I had a blast compiling all of this information in one spot. Plurality probably isn't the first thing people think about when talking about Fire Emblem, but it's surprisingly prevalent, and I can only hope this sparks a few new conversations about it. If you have any other questions for me, feel free to drop them in my Ask box on Tetrado. I've answered a lot of questions about DID on there, and I'd be happy to respond to things there because this is a YouTube video. I could do a question and answer section, and also, spoiler alert, I can't do one at the convention either because of time constraints. Also, you could just ask in YouTube comments, that's also very easy. The name of my Tetrado account is on screen though, and I post all of my answers to Blue Sky whenever I get around to them. You can find all of my social medias on the screen also, and if you want to check out my past EmblemCon panels, you can find them on my YouTube page as listed there, and I will also put the playlist with all of my past presentations down in the comments. Also, if you're interested in my book series, which may or may not have representation of plural characters in it later down the line, that's me saying it absolutely does, you can check out my social media, and there you'll be able to find my author profile. It's also just Crescent Zephyr. Just look it up. I write a book, it's awesome, and it has systems in it. Cool. So, with all of that rambling out of the way, thank you so much for coming, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Bye-bye!